So I will speak about half an hour on the past of the institution known as Haus der Kunst, Munich. The past I was exposed when I started working, to my great surprise, and the present, and I hope the future a little bit. The image I choose, and the image I always choose to represent and show what Haus der Kunst is this. It's a building that is literally let's say, the last step before the town. It's a door to the town. It's a building seen from above. It's a building seen from a flock of birds. It's a building seen from the moon. It's a building seen from a bee. It's a building with a very particular shape. It looks like a musical instrument. It looks like an harmonium. It looks also as a strange face with teeth. It is surrounded by water. There is water here. There is a canal on this side. This canal is quite known because there are surfers. It's a very well-known hotspot for surfers. And this canal on this side is less known. The two canals connect here, and then they run throughout the park. The park, known as the Englische Garten, is the biggest public park in the world, which is quite interesting point. So this building stays at the entrance of a park and has two faces, two directions. The image actually everyone has in mind or had in mind when I arrived is this image. It's the image of the building as it was in 1937 when it was opened directly by Adolf Hitler as the Haus der Kunst. So the home for German art, as a specifically addressing propaganda through art institution. And this image is the image that haunts and to some extent needs and asked also myself to be as much as possible memorialized. Not everyone knows necessarily that story, so I thought worth going quickly through some moments. So between 1937 and 1945, the institution worked as a permanent exhibition-making institution, the Große Deutsche Ausstellung, exhibition that was also meant to sell paintings, where paintings and sculpture were then sold and scattered throughout houses from all Bavaria, but also Germany, and also setting the canon for what art would have been, according to the wishes of the regime, of the dictatorship, but also for what art could not have been. And that's why, surprisingly enough, the other exhibition that happened in 1937, called Entartete Kunst, Degenerate Art, is seen as a benchmark, as a starting point for another idea for modern art. That's the exhibition where the most important expressionist artists, and not only the artists of the avant-garde, had been showing their work. And this happened literally 500 meters far from Haus der Kunst, in the Hofgarten, in another smaller, actually very smaller garden, where nowadays, more or less, an institute called Kunsthalle in München has is headquartered. And after the war, in 1945, the institution hosted a selection of paintings coming from the Pinakothek, and the Pinakotheken were bombed, and therefore you will have, for instance, associated by Dürer or works, fundamental works of the history of modern art. I'm talking about the art of the 15th, 16th, 17th century that are now beautifully displayed in the Alte Pinakothek in München. And that's also the year when the word Deutsch was taken out, and it's the year when Haus der Kunst became Haus der Kunst. In 1949, a fundamental exhibition of the Blaue Reiter was shown. The Blaue Reiter, as you all know, has its roots in München. So Franz Marc, Vassilis Kandinsky, Paul Klee, work were brought together. But more importantly, perhaps symbolically, as you all know, or I imagine you know, the Guernica by Pablo Picasso made her last tour as a wonderful testimony of what does it mean for art to react against, to take another position, to show the tragedy of war, and was shown in 1955 at Haus der Kunst as part of a Picasso survey show. And then will follow throughout the years exhibition of Van Gogh, Kandinsky, Rauschenberg, Klee, let's say the male masters of modernity, until 1992, when the institution becomes a Stiftung, a foundation in Germany, and takes a completely new direction. It's led by someone called Christoph Vitali, unfortunately passed away 3 years ago, and eventually by Chris Dercon, becoming a avant-garde or an institution that without collection that looks at the present in a different way, possibly combining arts in a different way. The focus Chris Dercon had was mostly on, of course, visual art, but also design and fashion, whilst the following director, Okvi Envenzo, focused the institution on form, on other perspective, on opening up to other worlds, other continents, and had this fundamental preoccupation for the question of post-coloniality, what post-coloniality is and what does it mean. And by doing this, it particularly focused on a crucial and, let's say, groundbreaking group exhibition was titled Post-War, art in the post-Second World War across the Pacific and the America. That's the story of the before. And this is when I started. I started in 2020, in May 2020, in full pandemic. There was no possibility to show anything. So we commissioned work to Franz Erhard Walter that had an exhibition inside, that at the same time would bridge the online. The work was a sequence of 4 images about bodies. I mean, Franz Erhard Walter is also known for his text wars at the beginning of his career, that all were projected on the building at night for 40 days, let's say somehow in dialogue with the idea of quarantine, what does it mean, and also hijacked for 4 days the website completely. So what I would like to speak about today is I will skip all past dialogues that happened more or less triggered mostly by Chris Dercon in the 28, 9, 10 philosophical ideas, the idea of the guiltiness of the walls. Are the walls, is the building guilty? Or the memory, what kind of memory the building carries? I would rather focus on what is a monument today. And there is no doubt that monument is the component of art history that has been more dramatically challenged in the last, let's say, 10 years worldwide, particularly in the imperialistic or formerly imperialistic countries, in the US, in the UK, and France. But worldwide, the monument has been finally dramatically questioned. And when we speak about monument, we don't speak about those, let's say, already institutional critique driven, let's say, attempts to challenge the monument that exist at least since the 70s. We speak really about those questionable, often tragic, ironically tragic statues that have been occupying, not inhabiting, occupying public spaces for too long, like for centuries, often remembering, often with having the aim of remember a man, often in a war situation, on a horse. Okay, all these have been questioned, taken down. Colleagues of ours are revisioning this structure, particularly in the US. Hansa Walker and Carl Walker are working on a groundbreaking exhibition that will happen next year at LX Art and MoCA in Los Angeles, exactly about what these objects are, what is the structure, what is the function. But what happened? I mean, I think we all witnessed what happened is that we not only we saw this moment of taking down, but we also witnessed this moment. We were part also this moment of assembly. We're also part of witnessing what we would call the memorial as a sort of underground or subcultural form blossoming and becoming worldwide scattered. So the memorial that will happen when a pop icon would die, like the generation in a corner in a public space in front of her house on a symbolic place of something memorializing that figure, became the tool that was deployed by citizens when the necessity of memorializing terrible event, be it the death of Breonna Taylor or the killing of Breonna Taylor, the killing of George Floyd, generated that image, no? That situation of memorial, no? And that image, the image of, let's say George Floyd, is an image that immediately in few hours was out there all over the world and became that question of what a memorial is and what the dialogue between memorial and monument is. So a monument always expresses a past statement. That's a fact, no? A statement of the past. And the act of remembering, but remembering what? That's the main question. And remembering what moment, what specific moment. Monuments, as I say, changed. They became made of sound, they became performative, they became moving image driven. Actually, in the public space, in the public sphere, we somehow, from an art history perspective, but also from a civic servant perspective, the perspective has been so beautifully represented recently in the transformation of the definition of what a museum is, no? The one that was approved almost a year ago in August through the ICOM, no? The International Association Council of All Museums, tells us that museums have also now finally a different function. So with all this, I guess we should engage and we should more and more confront ourselves, particularly if we have to do with buildings, whose memory we don't necessarily acknowledge. We acknowledge the necessity of memorializing, but buildings whose perception is somehow stuck into a memory that we do not think is the memory. We do think, or I do think, that there are many layers of memory. And in that many layers of memory is probably the most relevant definition, or in my opinion, of what a monument could be. And that's why I would like to emphasize the difference between monument and monumentality. A monumental building, like the Haus der Kunst, for instance, the Kunsthalle in Bielefeld, is not necessarily carrying the issues of the monument. It's instead carrying the issues, and that's my proposal, and that's why the title of this quick journey, it's carrying the memory of everyone who entered that space, that place, that home, that institution throughout time, and was exposed to a program that generates, and that's I think our main challenge, generates the condition as, let's say, programmers, as makers, enablers, like thinkers of how, what needs to be blockchain, what needs to be transmitted of the present and of the recent present towards the future, in order for this not to be slipping out, in order not for being hundreds, years or decades delayed towards structural issues that have to do with representation of migration or awful, let's say, legacy of colonialism or question of displacement. Huh? So all this is, or part of this, is already part of the programs that we have been supporting, generating, and also are keen on keeping happening and blending in as much as possible meaningful, acknowledging new lineages form of programming. So my main question was, and is when I started at Haus der Kunst, why I'm exposed so dramatically to a memory that no one actually can almost recall anywhere in any way. And what happened to the recent history? Why is this gone? Why it kind of slips out? How can we generate a tool for this not to happen? And should we perhaps think about the museum as, in this I'm slightly more lucky in the situation I find myself, because there is no collection. So there is a sort of challenging situation of an empty space resonating, an empty space that is going to be even more dramatically challenged in a few years when refurbishment like in BFM is starting and they won't be building anymore. A trauma, but also an incredible opportunity, because in that time, the last, at least for me, the last most challenging legacy of the late modernism art history tradition, which we all acknowledge being the white cube, but it's not only the white cube, it's all the infrastructure of ceremonies that are around this, including the building, won't be available. So that's when this will happen. On the one hand, you, as someone in my position, you could be terrified because you are thinking about interim situation and any possible other option. But actually, I'm extremely excited because we have the opportunity to generate this incredible challenge of building a community that in the years before the refurbishment, that will be the community that generates that acknowledgement of that idea of, let's call it Haus der Kunst, but could be also Kunsthalle, that is the unfolding monument that exists in the public space and needs to be there as a form of representation or a form of echoing for the current societies and the stories the current society wants to carry, which are not necessarily society-related issues, art history, contemporary arts history-related issue that could and normally would carry the histories of the society in her transforming, or needs transforming. I hope it's not too complicated to follow, but this is somehow the radical proposal. Is it possible to see the museum as a monument? If it is true that the monument is witnessing an history, isn't it perhaps so interesting provocation to think about the museum as the ultimate public space that is generating memory in real time and aims to transmit this memory in a way that is like encountering and then memorialized rather than monumentalized. So that's the question I'm asking myself, and this is somehow the challenge I'm working towards. And this I could run through. How do we do it at the Haus der Kunst? And I try to do it with a program in which there are specific areas that are somehow constantly dedicated to specific questions, so that throughout time, they are, for even shorter times, they are somehow recognizable, knowing and acknowledging that the main partner we are working with, no, is the society and is a local society. And on the other hand, the tool is trying to, as much as possible, bring together lines of programming, not thinking about isolated show, not thinking about the old theory of the sandwich, no, like You have something experimental, something blockbusterish, and something more youngish, and then comes something recognizable, and you go across genre, like painting, sculpture, new media, and performative practices. But you just think about the whole, and you bring everything together, and that's why we are moving towards a definition of Haus der Kunst rather than Haus der Kunst. And in doing this, you also draw lineages that are lineages that you wouldn't necessarily see or have seen so far. And then I could speak for a longer time about not having a collection. What does it mean for an institution like Haus der Kunst, orienting as much as possible on producing, and on producing particularly forms of art that we think are relevant of the recent late modernity or the post-war time, but are disappeared or being taken out, like the environment, like that form that one may associate to Kurt Schwitters and Lucia Fontana, but actually has astonishing women artists representing, like Marta Minuhin or Niki de Sanfal, and then continuing towards such a glorious and wonderful tradition. And or putting this in resonance with practices that are happening globally, that are therefore transnational and also transgenerational. So like the aim of like telling histories remains, but the attitude is that to trying to fit this storytelling into a broader understanding of what the institution is rather than what the building is, and a broader understanding of what the aim of the institution, the fundamental urgency and necessity of survival that the institution have should be. And I wanted this to be the first image. Actually, the first gesture I did when I arrived, I said during the pandemic, was like I found in the basement the still in good condition work that was made by Mel Bochner called The Joys of Yiddish, conceived for the front of the institution, right? Like for where the trees are now, for not actually really visible. And I asked Mel whether he would have been so open to donate the work to the institution, but actually to hang it in the back towards the park, where the bar is during the summer, but also where people are daily walking, as a permanent, let's say, monumental sign in the moment when everyone was taking down the monuments, but in a moment when there was maximum need of public understanding space. And somehow to keep that memory of that language, it was an underground language, or there was a language that became underground and almost disappeared, alive, to somehow memorialize or contribute to memorialize one of the main histories of the building, the one that is at the beginning, the most awful, but at the same time, to keep going throughout the program that at the moment also is preoccupied to take and inhabit a public space around or surrounding the institution, commissioning artists like Tony Cooks in specific spaces, or Joan Jonas, or it will come like Fujiko Nakaya to inhabit, to spill out in the public space, and then now Rilke Tiravanija and many more, to somehow guarantee the institution with a sort of memory of signs and codes that will be there, will be up, were there, or will be there, and it may be transferred temporarily when the institution won't be there anymore, when the building won't be there anymore, to somewhere where the building will be. I'm talking about the refurbishment time, or where the building won't be. And then maybe the building, there won't be any need of a building, and the building will be a festival for months, but these signs will be still there to somehow contribute to memorialize the many histories of an institution that shouldn't be stuck into that history, but should be acknowledged for the extraordinary challenges that the institution made, and particularly in the last 30, 20, 10 years, when the arts have been pushed so further by the extraordinary generation of artists that are working in this time and have been working the last time, that finally need to be acknowledged, as I say, either because of the exclusion given by the, let's say, sexual, let's say, simple identity or their provenance. As I said, I made like a 40 pages PowerPoint, but I think it's time for me to stop here, and I'm very curious to listen to my following colleagues and being therefore eventually involved in a discussion. Thank you so much.